Right, you are on me. My apologies. I had some noise in my ear, a bit of confusion. And Nhlanhla Nene, the Finance Minister, on his first visit to Washington since his reinstatement in February. He joins me now. Minister, a warm welcome and welcome back to Washington. How does it feel to be back after a 2-year hiatus, which was, of course, not self-imposed?
Sabbatical, I call it. When I've just returned to a changed environment, but only to the extent that if you look back in 2015 when last I was here, we were talking about global growth, which was below the 3% levels. We're talking 3.9% growth now. So there are developments and there is an upswing. But of course, there are risks and challenges, one of them being the trade wars that are playing themselves out. The debates are more about also the blending of a coordinated approach between the emerging economies and the developed economies in finding solutions to these challenges, because there is recognition that we can only resolve these challenges if we work together. So we're talking about a coordinated approach to deal with the challenges. We are talking about this protectionist approach that arises out of the headwinds that are pushing economies back, and people are tempted to move into protectionist approaches in order to fight that. But there is general understanding that we actually need to move in tandem in order to get out of it. Issues of unemployment that we're confronted with as a country and as emerging economies are at the top of our agenda. So inclusive growth becomes part of our agenda collectively. And as we move on, also we are beginning to look at what are the key areas that we could actually find each other.
Minister, I want to take you just a step back. You say you were on this sabbatical. What were your expectations, coming back into Treasury, and what is it that you found as Finance Minister?
Well, it is difficult to talk about expectations because in the first place I never expected to return to the National Treasury. So having been called back into government, one found that you hit the ground running because you have challenges. In the first week that I came to work, we had to deal with Moody's, who had actually placed us on review, and we're coming back after 6 months, and wanted us to put our case forward in order to be able to pronounce on South Africa's credit rating. The following week we had to go out on an investor roadshow to talk to investors, and the budget had just been tabled in February, and so within a few weeks' time I had to make sure that all of that has to be dealt with in a matter of...
A question that I get a lot, Minister, is how are people receiving Nhlanhla Nene and his team here in Washington? What's your sense of the mood, certainly from the stakeholders you engage with here in Washington?
Well, I must say that I've been kept very busy because I've been reconnecting with old colleagues that I worked with in the past, former ministers, some ministers of finance, and some of them who have staying power, who have been in their positions for long, and some of them, like me, also have stepped in and out of their positions. But more than anything, it's beginning to look back at where we come from. Actually, one of the former ministers who's now ambassador here is Minister Joe Hockey from Australia, who's now ambassador here. When I spoke to his minister, he actually has shown an interest in meeting with me. We've met with the EU. We've met everybody else that I've worked with in the past. It's a matter of actually beginning to look at where we were back in 2015, which was your first question when we met.
Right.
And this is precisely what we are all beginning to look at. Some of the issues have moved from there, but some of the issues also haven't moved that much from the time.
And one of those issues, Minister, that hasn't moved that much is South Africa's growth trajectory, right? We've been stuck in this low growth trap. The President has put a number on the table of 3%. We saw fourth quarter growth in 2017 at 3.1%, so it's possible. It needs to be sustained. The IMF report has talked about the need for South Africa to attract greater investment, to deal with policy uncertainty. What's your sense of 3% from the President and what is actually going to be possible? Because that's essentially your job.
Look, it might look an ambitious target, But the fact of the matter is that if we do all the right things, and all of those things are actually encapsulated in the budget review 2018. If you look at, for instance, the issue of confidence alone, has already started yielding results in terms of some of the green shoots that we are beginning to see. Which can actually be quantified at 0.5%.
Okay.
And if you look at some of the barriers to entry that we need, all of our structural adjustments or reforms that we need to focus on are intended to begin to shift the needle upwards. If you look at the telecommunications space, the issue of the spectrum, all of those things are already on the table. And if we are able to address our challenges in the state-owned companies who actually are a big drain on the fiscus, and if we are able to implement what is currently being worked on between my colleague, Minister Gordon, and myself, we're beginning to look at a much more comprehensive approach of dealing with governance in state-owned companies, dealing with their financial sustainability, but dealing with costing of their developmental mandate versus their sustainability, financial sustainability, putting in place in terms of governance, the boards, appointing the correct executives into positions, but also looking at there is now the private sector participation framework for state-owned companies, which we're beginning to look at how would it change the composition and the picture and the structure of our state-owned companies.
Are you satisfied with the restructuring that has taken place in the short term? I know you guys have only been in your positions for less than 2 months. We've seen changes in Denel, we've seen changes in SAA, Eskom. Is that moving fast enough, and does it satisfy IMF expectations?
It's work in progress, Sharon. It's unless you're not going to rush into anything, because we need to do the right thing and do it properly. So it's work in progress, and I think we are finding each other. A lot of things have already happened. If you look at Eskom, which is our largest in terms of being a heavy drain on the fiscus in terms of the guarantees, but at the same time looking at how the company itself continues to execute its mandate. And you now have a new board, you now have new executive, and all the people involved in corruption are beginning to face the consequences. All of those things are happening in a very short space of time. But that's putting in place the right fundamentals before you move on. But there are many others also that we're working on.
Let's just stay on Eskom for a moment. I know Pravin Gordhan's meeting with the leadership of the World Bank. There has been some concern expressed about corruption at Eskom by the bank in terms of the $3.75 billion loan that was awarded to Eskom in 2010. What's your sense? Is there going to be a recall of that loan, or are you still talking about that?
Look, I think we're fairly okay on that one, because all the requirements for that loan are being met. As you know, that the IPPs have been signed, because that was also part, because this comes from the Global Environment Fund, which also had an element of making sure that whilst it is investing in coal, but we also need to look at our progress in our renewable energy program. So that indicates that we are on the right track in terms of meeting the requirements of that loan, but it is important to stay in touch with our lenders, in this instance the World Bank, and if the relevant minister talks to them, he is talking from and will be providing them with tangible evidence of developments in that space.
A couple more questions before I let you go, Minister. The debt to GDP ratio above 50% for South Africa, it has been flagged. I mean, I think the global GDP ratio is about 225%, several $1 trillion, numbers too big to mention in rand denominations. What's your sense of how South Africa is grappling with its debt situation?
Look, we need to keep it within sustainable levels, and sustainable levels for us are determined by our ability to service that debt, but also because the most critical thing is whether you actually are at risk of defaulting on your debt. So it could be high, as you would know, the US is at it's above 100, and you have correctly pointed out. But because of the size of the economy and all other indicators, it is clear that the markets would still see that as an acceptable level. So even in our case, it's not just the level, but it's also making sure that all the other fundamentals are in place so that the risk of default is not factored into the picture.
What's your sense about a trade war? I know it's a big conversation point,
trade
protectionism.
Wars, we actually are impacted upon. We are a small open economy which are vulnerable to the volatilities and the movements outside of our borders, because we trade with the world ourselves, but also we take the price in terms of the movement in the exchange rate and all other indicators.
All right, Minister Nhlanhla Nene, thank you so much for coming to speak with us, and good luck with the rest of your engagements here in Washington. The man of the moment on his first return since being reappointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa to head the Treasury. Nhlanhla Nene speaking to us here. Coming up in just a little while, the Reserve Bank Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, of course also in his capacity as chairman of the International Monetary and Financial Committee. Sorry guys, I couldn't hear you earlier.